Well, I guess we're already ready to go. Let me welcome folks to Weekly Marx. It's a Saturday, and we're sort of at 3-ish. Not quite sure what else is happening this evening, but there will be other things this evening. Um, Today, I'd like to continue on in we were looking at fictitious capital last Saturday. This time, I decided I would pick a topic from the end of the Michael Hudson text, where he's talking a little bit about rent. And so, on that score, or on that idea, and because I have this general interest in doing rent stuff, and I have been for years now, unfortunately. Um, I wanted to go back and in terms of giving people a sense of the basic literature, the foundational literature, is to go to the 1844 economic and philosophical manuscripts and look at that particular section on rent, mainly because it does relate to the Michael Hudson work as you get towards the end on rent. So there's there's method to my madness. And so rent sort of represents a necessity to have a clear understanding of the distinction between um, value and organic compositions of capital and their relationship to the increasing technical composition. That's the fundamental Marxian thing at the core. These distinctions tend not to be ignored, not only to be ignored, but conflated with one another. So value, as opposed to organic compositions of capital, with its relation to technical composition, is always and continuing to be a problem, particularly on the issue of rent. Rent represents a kind of intersection, a way in which you could sort of assess under capitalism why things why value gets all out of control. And this past week, we've been looking at the background chapters for, I assume this Sunday in Class Unity that Michael Hudson will be visiting. I'm not sure, maybe at some other time on a Wednesday or something. But regardless, his particular text on the killing the host is still what we've been covering over there. And as often it seems to be redundant or repetitious, it still sets up, and in fact, the repetition actually helps, not unlike reading stuff in the Koran, etc. So, the economic and philosophic manuscripts, remember, these are the things that are discovered later that give, for a whole variety of post-war Marxists, the idea that there's a humanist interpretation of Marx that is not quite so, that is heterodox or less orthodox, that isn't quite as deterministic in that particular sense, or that determinisms are multiple or open. So I'll get right down to it here. Now, in the bold, I've bolded what are Marx's writings and notes, the central core of it. But as you'll notice in his manuscripts, he does a lot of copying of other people. I mean, it's not like he's plagiarizing it. He cites it correctly, and it is expository in that sense. And so the first time I read this, I got a little confused, and I think I confused the folks I was sort of yammering about this too. That there are all these quotations from Say and from Smith and Ricardo, and you have to sort of see them in context, but they're of a piece in the sense that Marx's voice is still there. And at the end, he summarizes, he synthesizes what these things are. So it seems somewhat confusing on the one hand. On the other hand, you can see that this situates Marx in a classical economic tradition. And often that is the way that in the history of economic thought, if you're going to organize folks, organize certain sections of political economy, you're going to include Marx in with Smith and Ricardo, because he's making a critique of the political economy, the dominant political economy represented by people like Smith and Ricardo, among others. So we're looking at a very small portion on the one hand. On the other hand, it's a thing that is quite current and quite problematic as we begin to rethink what are these rent type elements. And as we pointed out in the other text, that they are an example of or a result of finance capital, the operations of finance capital. They operate much better, more efficiently, more effectively, more insidiously as finance capital. But we're not talking about finance capital, we're talking about rent specifically. And we're also talking about seaweed. So we'll talk about seaweed too. Landlord's right has its origin in robbery. The landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they have never sowed and demand a rent even for the natural produce of the earth. The rent of land, it may be thought, is frequently no more than a reasonable profit or interest for the stock laid out by the landlord upon its improvement. This, no doubt, may be partly the case upon some occasions. The landlord demands, number one, a rent, even for unimproved land, and the supposed interest or profit upon the expense of improvement is generally in addition to this original rent. Number two, those improvements, besides, are not always made by the stock of the landlord, but sometimes by that of the tenant. When the lease comes to be renewed, however, the landlord commonly demands the same augmentation of rent as if they had all been made by his own. Number three, he sometimes demands rent for what is altogether incapable of human improvement. So he's already making this, observing that Smith is observing, that rent isn't quite fair in that sense. And Smith cites, this is Marx writing, Smith cites as an instance of the last case, kelp. Kelp is a species of seaweed, which when burnt yields an alkaline salt useful for making glass, soap, etc. It grows in several parts of Great Britain, particularly in Scotland, upon such rocks only as lie within the high water mark, which are twice every day covered with the sea, and of which the produce, therefore, was never augmented by human industry. The landlord, however, whose estate is bounded by a kelp shore of this kind, demands a rent for it, as much as for his cornfields. The sea in the neighborhood of the islands of Shetland, remember, corn here also means wheat. The sea in the neighborhood of the islands of Shetland is more than commonly abundant in fish, which make a great part of the subsistence of their inhabitants. However, but in order to profit by the produce of the water, they must have a habitation upon the neighboring land. The rent of the landlord is in proportion not to what the farmer can make by the land, but to what he can make both by the land and by the water. This is from Adam Smith. This rent may be considered the produce of those powers of nature, the use of which the landlord lends to the farmer. It is greater or smaller according to the supposed extent of those powers, or in other words, according to the supposed nature or improved fertility of the land. It is the work of nature which remains after deducting or compensating everything which can be regarded as the work of man. The rent of land, therefore, still Smith talking, considered as the price paid for the use of the land, is naturally a monopoly price. It is not at all proportioned to what the landlord may have laid out upon the improvement of the land, or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give. Of the three original classes, that of the landlords is one whose revenue costs them neither labor nor care, but comes to them, as it were, of its own accord and independent of any plan or project of their own. And this is Marx now. We've already learned that the size of the rent depends on the degree of the fertility of the land. This is a Ricardian observation as well. And Marx says in this one more important kind of idea that goes to, well, I suppose we could say it's Hegelian. We can use this in a variety of different ways. I probably worth looking at in whatever it was originally written in, which probably was German. Another factor in its determination is situation. And this is from Smith. The rent of land not only varies with its fertility, whatever be its produce, but with its situation, whatever be its fertility. The produce of land mines and fisheries, when their natural fertility is equal, this is this idea of a natural monopoly, is in proportion to the extent and proper application of the capitals employed about them. When the capitals are equal and equally well applied, it is in proportion to their natural fertility. And here's Marx talking. These propositions of Smith are important because, given equal costs of production and capital of equal size, they reduce the rent of land to the greater or lesser fertility of the soil, thereby showing clearly the perversion of concepts in political economy, which turns the fertility of the land into an attribute of the landlord. Now, let us consider the rent of land as it formed in real life. The rent of land is established as the result of the struggle between tenant and landlord. We find that the hostile antagonism of interests, the struggle, the war is recognized throughout political economy as the basis of social organization. This is Marx leading into the next set of quotations. Marx says, let us see now what the relations are between landlord and tenant. And this next section is from Adam Smith. In adjusting the terms of the lease, the landlord endeavors to leave him no greater share of the produce than what is sufficient to keep up the stock, from which he furnishes the seed, pays the labor, and purchases and maintains the cattle and other instruments of husbandry, together with the ordinary profits of farming stock in the neighborhood. This is evidently the smallest share with which the tenant can content himself without being a loser, and the landlord seldom means to leave him any more. Whatever part of the produce, or what is the same thing, whatever part of its price is over and above this share, he naturally endeavors to reserve to himself as the rent of his land, which is evidently the highest the tenant can afford to pay in the actual circumstances of the land. This portion, however, may still be considered as the natural rent of land, or the rent for which it is naturally meant that land should, for the most part, be lent. The landlords operate a certain kind of monopoly against the tenants. The demand for their commodities, site and soil, can go on expanding indefinitely, but there's only a given and limited amount of their commodity. The bargain struck between landlord and tenant is always advantageous to the former in the greatest possible degree. Besides the advantage he derives from the nature of the case, he derives a further advantage from his position, his larger fortune and greater credit and standing. But the first by itself suffices to enable him and him alone to profit from the favorable circumstances of the land. The opening of a canal or a road, the increase of population and the prosperity of a district always raises the rent. Indeed, the tenant himself may improve the ground at his own expense, but he only derives the profit from this capital for the duration of his lease, with the expiry of which it remains with the proprietor of the land. Henceforth, it is the latter, that is the proprietor of the land, who reaps the interest upon without having made the outlay, for there is now a proportionate increase in the rent. Another quote from Smith, rent, considered as the price paid for the use of land, is naturally the highest which the tenant can afford to pay in the actual circumstances of the land. The rent is more Smith. The rent of an estate above ground commonly amounts to what is supposed to be a third of the gross produce, and is generally a rent certain and independent of the occasional variations in the crop. This rent is seldom less than a fourth of the whole produce. Here's Marx writing. Rent cannot be paid on all commodities. For instance, in many districts, no rent is paid for stones. Such parts only of the produce of land can commonly be brought to market, of which the ordinary price is sufficient to replace the stock which must be employed in bringing them thither, together with its ordinary profits. If the ordinary price is more than this, the surplus part of it will naturally go to the rent of the land. If it is not more, though the commodity may be brought to market, it can afford no rent to the landlord. Whatever the price is or is not, more depends upon the demand. This is Smith talking. Smith continues, rent, it is to be observed, therefore enters into the composition of the price of commodities in a different way from wages and profit. High or low wages and profit are the causes of high or low price. High or low rent is the effect of it. And here's Marx just inserting a little comment. Food belongs to the products which always yields a rent. And then he goes back to I think this is Smith still, yes. As men, like all other animals, naturally multiply in proportion to the means of their subsistence, food is always more or less in demand. It can always purchase or command a greater or smaller quantity of labor, and some can always be found who is willing to do something in order to obtain it. The quantity of labor, indeed, which it can purchase is not always equal to what it could maintain if managed in the most economical manner on account of the high wages which are sometimes given to labor, but can always purchase such a quantity of labor as it can maintain, according to the rate at which the sort of labor is commonly maintained in the neighborhood. More Smith. But land, in almost any situation, produces a greater quantity of food than what is sufficient to maintain all the labor necessary for bringing it to market, in the most liberal way in which that labor is ever maintained. The surplus, too, is also more than sufficient to replace the stock which employed that labor, together with its profits. Something, therefore, always remains for a rent to the landlord. Food, in this Moore Smith, food in this manner, not only in the original source of rent, but every other part of the produce of land which afterwards affords rent, derives that part of its value from the improvement of the powers of labor in producing food by means of the improvement and cultivation of land. Human food seems to be the only produce of land which always and necessarily affords some rent to the landlord. Countries are populous not in proportion to the number of people whom their produce can clothe and lodge, but in proportion to that of those whom it can feed. After food, clothing and lodging are the two great wants of mankind. They usually yield a rent, but not inevitably. So Marx comments on this. Let us now see how the landlord exploits everything from which society benefits. Quoting Smith, the rent of land increases with population, straight being axiomatic here. Number two, we have already learned from Say how the rent of land increases with railways, etc., with the improvement, safety, and multiplication of the means of communication. Every improvement, number three, every improvement in the circumstances of the society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord, his power of purchasing the labor or the produce of the labor of other people. The extension of improvement and cultivation tends to raise it directly. The landlord's share of the produce necessarily increases with the increase in the produce. That rise in the real price of those parts of the rude produce of land, the rise in the price of cattle, for example, tends to also to raise the rent of land directly, and still in greater proportion. The real value of the landlord's share, his real command of the labor of other people, not only rises with the real value of the produce, but the proportion of this share to the whole produce rises with it. That produce, after the rise in its real price, requires no more labor to collect it than before. A smaller proportion of it will, therefore, be sufficient to replace with the ordinary profit the stock which employs that labor. A greater proportion of it, consequently, belong to the landlord. All that from Adam Smith. Now back to Marx. Now, the greater demand for raw produce and therefore the rise in value may in part result from the increase in population and from the increase of their needs. But every new invention, every new application in manufacture of a previously unused or little used raw material augments rent. Thus, for example, there was a tremendous rise in the rent of coal mines with the advent of the railways and steamships. This is still Marx. Besides this advantage which the landlord derives from manufactured discoveries in labor, there is yet another, as we shall presently see. And now he's back to quoting Smith. All those improvements, it's number 4, all those improvements in the productive powers of labor, which tend directly to reduce the real price of manufacturers, tend indirectly to raise the real rent of land. The landlord exchanges that part of his rude produce, which is over and above his own consumption, or what comes to the same thing, the price of that part of it, for manufactured produce. Whatever reduces the real price of the latter raises that of the former. An equal quantity of the former becomes therefore equivalent to a greater quantity of the latter, and the landlord is enabled to pursue or purchase a greater quantity of the convenience, ornaments, or luxuries, which he has occasion for. Back to Marx. But it is silly to conclude, as Smith does, that since the landlord exploits every benefit which comes to society, the interest of the landlord is always identical with that of society. In the economic system, under the rule of private property, the interest which an individual has in society is in precisely inverse proportion to the interest that society has in him, just as the interest of the usurer in the spendthrift is no means identical with the interest of the spendthrift. He's trying to make this a kind of, he's identifying the contingencies, or like property, between those who owe and those between debt and credit in that particular sense. We shall mention only in passing the landlord's obsession with monopoly directed against the landed property of foreign countries from which the corn laws, for instance, originate. Likewise, we shall here pass over medieval serfdom, the slavery in the colonies, and the miserable condition of the country folk, the day laborers in Great Britain. Let us confine ourselves to the propositions of a political economy itself. This is still Marx writing. Number 1, the landlord being interested in the welfare of society means, according to the principles of political economy, that he's interested in the growth of its population and manufacture, in the expansion of its needs, in short, the increase of wealth. And this increase of wealth is, as we've already seen, identical to the increase of poverty and slavery. The relation between increasing house rent and increasing poverty is an example of the landlord's interest in society. For the ground rent, the interest obtained from the land on which the house stands goes up with the rent of the house. Number 2, according to the political economists themselves, the landlord's interest is inimically opposed to the interest of the tenant farmer, and thus already to a significant section of society. Marx is identifying the asymmetry. 3, as the landlord can demand all the more rent from the tenant farmer, the less wages the farmer pays, and as the farmer forces down wages all the lower, the more rent the landlord demands. It follows that the interest of the landlord is just as hostile to that of the farm workers as is that of the manufacturers to their workers. He likewise forces down wages to the minimum. Number 4, since a real reduction in the price of manufactured products raises the rent of land, the landowner has a direct interest in lowering the wages of industrial workers, in competition amongst the capitalists, in overproduction, and all the misery associated with industrial production. Number 5, while thus the landlord's interest, far from being identical with the interests of society, stands inimically opposed to the interest of tenant farmers, farm laborers, factory workers, and capitalists. On the other hand, excuse me, the interest of one landlord is not even identical with that of another on account of the competition, which we will now consider. Excuse me. In general, the relationship of large and small landed property is like that of big and small capital. But in addition, there are special circumstances which lead inevitably to the accumulation of large landed property and to the absorption of small property by it. Next section. Nowhere does the relative number of workers and implements decrease more with increases in the size of the stock than in landed property. Likewise, the possibility of all-round exploitation, of economizing production costs, and of effective division of labor increases nowhere more with the size of the stock than in landed property, landed inherited property. However small a field may be, it requires for its working a certain irreducible minimum of implements. You need a plow, saw, etc., whilst the size of a piece of landed property can be reduced far below this minimum. Number two, big landed property accumulates to itself the interest on the capital which the tenant farmer has employed to improve the land. Small landed property has to employ its own capital and therefore does not get this profit at all. Number three, while every social improvement benefits the big estate, it harms small property because it increases its need for ready cash. Number four, two important laws concerning this competition remain to be considered. Subsection alpha, the rent of the cultivated land, and this is a quote from Smith, of which the produce is human food, regulates the rent of the greater part of the other cultivated land. Ultimately, only the big estate can produce such food as cattle, etc. Therefore, it regulates the rent of other land and can force it down to a minimum. However, the small landed proprietor working on his own land stands then to the big landowner in the same relation as an artisan possessing his own tool to the factory owner. Small property and land has become a mere instrument of labor. Rent entirely disappears for the small proprietor. There remains to him as at most the interest on his capital and his wages, for rent can be driven down by competition until it is nothing more than the interest on capital not invested by the proprietor. Beta, subsection beta. The next one is gamma, right? In addition, we have already learned that with equal fertility and equally efficient exploitation of lands, mines, and fisheries, the produce is proportionate to the size of the capital, hence the victory of the big landowner. Similarly, where equal capitals are employed, the product is proportionate to the fertility. Hence, where capitals are equal, victory goes to the proprietor of the more fertile soil. This is the whole business about, the power of property. And so gamma, a mine of any kind, this is a quote from Smith, a mine of any kind can be said to be either fertile or barren, according as the quantity of mineral which can be brought from it by a certain quantity of labor is greater or less than what can be brought by an equal quantity from the greater part of other mines of the same kind. Obviously, could be written a little tighter. Another quote from Smith, culled by Marx. The most fertile coal mine, too, regulates the price of coal at all the other mines in the neighborhood. Both the proprietor and the undertaker of the work find the one that he can get at a better rent, the other that he can get a greater profit by somewhat underselling all their neighbors. Their neighbors are soon obliged to sell at the same price, though they cannot so well afford it, and though it always diminishes and sometimes takes away altogether both their rent and their profit. Some works, that is mining works, are abandoned altogether. Others can afford no rent and can be wrought only by the proprietor. More Smith. After the discovery of the mines of Peru, the silver mines of Europe were, the greater part of them, abandoned. This was the case, too, with the mines of Cuba and San Domingo, and even with the ancient mines of Peru after the discovery of those of Potosi. What Smith here says, this is Marx talking, what Smith here says of mines applies more or less to landed property generally. So, sigma. The ordinary Market price of land, it is to be observed, depends everywhere upon the ordinary market rate of interest. If the rent of land should fall short of the interest of money by a greater difference, nobody would buy land, which would soon reduce its ordinary price. On the contrary, if the advantages should much more than compensate the difference, everybody would buy land, which again would soon raise its ordinary price. This is Marx writing. From this relation of rent of land to interest on money, it follows that rent must fall more and more so that eventually only the wealthiest people can live on rent. Hence the ever greater competition between landowners who do not lease their land to tenants. Ruin of some of these, further accumulation of large landed property. This competition has the further consequences still Marx, that a large part of landed property falls into the hands of the capitalists, and the capitalists thus become simultaneously landowners, just as the smaller landowners are on the whole already nothing more than capitalists. Similarly, a large section or a section of large landowners become at the same time industrialists. This is still Marx here. The final consequence is thus the abolition of the distinction between capitalist and landowner, so that there remain altogether only two classes of the population, the working class and the class of capitalists. This huckstering with landed property, the transformation of landed property into commodity, constitutes the final overthrow of the old and final establishment of the money aristocracy. Number one, we will not join in the sentimental tears wept over this by Romanticism. Romanticism always confuses the shamefulness of huckstering the land with a perfectly rational consequence, inevitable and desirable within the realm of private property, of the huckstering of private property and land. In the first place, feudal landed property is already by its very nature huckstered land, the earth which is estranged from man and hence confronts him in the shape of a few great lords. The domination of the land as an alien power over men is already inherent in feudal landed property. The serf is the adjunct of the land. Likewise, the lord of an entailed estate, the firstborn son, belongs to the land. It inherits him. Indeed, the dominion of private property begins with property and land. That is its basis. But in feudal landed property, the lord at least appears as the king of the estate. You can see a value thing going on here. Similarly, there still exists the semblance of a more intimate connection between the proprietor and the land than that of mere material wealth. The estate is individualized with its lord. It has his rank. It is baronial or ducal with him, has his privileges, his jurisdiction, his political position, etc. It appears as the inorganic body of its lord. Hence the proverb nulle terrae sunt maître. There is no land without its master, which expresses the fusion of nobility and landed property. Similarly, the rule of landed property does not appear directly as the rule of mere capital. For those belonging to it, the estate is more like their fatherland. It is a constricted sort of nationality. More Marx. In the same way, feudal landed property gives its name to its lord, as does a kingdom to its king, his family history, the history of his house. All of this individualizes the estate for him and makes it literally his house, personifies it. Similarly, those working on the estate have not the position of day laborers, but they are in part themselves his property, as are serfs. And in part, they are bound to him by ties of respect, allegiance, and duty. His relation to them is therefore directly political and has likewise a human intimate side. Customs, character, etc. vary from one estate to another and seem to be one with the land to which they belong. Whereas later, it is only his purse and not his character, his individuality, which connects a man with an estate. Finally, The feudal lord does not try to extract the utmost advantage from his land. Rather, he consumes what is there and calmly leaves the worry of producing to the serfs and the tenants. Such is nobility's relationship to landed property, which casts a romantic glory on its lords. More Marx. It is necessary that this appearance be abolished, that landed property, the root of private property, be dragged completely into the movement of private property, and that it become a commodity, that the rule of the proprietor appear as the undisguised rule of private property, of capital, freed of political tincture, that the relationship between proprietor and worker be reduced to the economic relationship of exploiter and exploited, that all personal relationship between the proprietor and his property cease, property becoming merely objective material wealth, that the marriage of convenience should take the place of marriage of honor with the land, and that the land should likewise sink to the status of a commercial value like man. It is essential that that which is the root of landed property, filthy self-interest, make its appearance too in its cynical form. It is essential that the immovable monopoly turn into the mobile and restless monopoly, into competition, and that the idle enjoyment of the products of other people's blood and sweat turn into a bustling commerce in the same commodity. Lastly, it is essential that in this competition, landed property in the form of capital manifests its dominion over both the working class and the proprietors themselves, who are either being ruined or raised by the laws governing the movement of capital. The medieval proverb, nulle terre sans seigneur, there is no land without its lord, is thereby replaced by that other proverb, l'argent n'a pas de maître, money knows no master, wherein is expressed the complete domination of dead matter over man. So, you can see kind of where Marx is going, in terms of the idea of a certain degree of abstraction moving forward. Number 2. More Marx. Concerning the argument of division or non-division of landed property, the following is to be observed. The division of landed property negates the large-scale monopoly of property in land, abolishes it, but only by generalizing this monopoly. It does not abolish the source of monopoly, that is, private property. It attacks the existing form, but not the essence of monopoly. The consequence is that it falls victim to the laws of private property. For the division of landed property corresponds to the movement of competition in this sphere of industry. In addition to the economic disadvantages of such a dividing up of the instruments of labor and the dispersal of labor to be clearly distinguished from the division of labor, in separated labor, the work is not shared out amongst many, but each carries on the same work by himself. It is a multiplication of the same work. This division of land, like that competition in industry, necessarily turns again into accumulation. Therefore, where the division of landed property takes place, there remains nothing for it to return to monopoly, but to return to monopoly in a still more malignant form, or to negate, to abolish the division of landed property itself. To do that, however, is not to return to feudal ownership, but to abolish private property in the soil altogether. The first abolition of monopoly is always its generalization, the broadening of its existence. The abolition of monopoly, once it has come to exist in its utmost breadth and inclusiveness, is its total annihilation. Association applied to land shares the economic advantage of large-scale landed property and first brings to realization the original tendency inherent in land division, namely quality. In the same way, association also reestablishes, now on a rational basis, no longer mediated by serfdom, overlordship, and the silly mysticism of property, the intimate ties of man with the earth, since the earth ceases to be an object of huckstering and through free labor and free enjoyment becomes once more a true personal property of man. So you can see the ecological thing going on here. A great advantage of the division of landed property is that the masses, which can no longer resign themselves to servitude, perish through property in a different way than in industry. As for large landed property, its defenders have always sophistically identified the economic advantages offered by large-scale agriculture with large-scale landed property, as if it were not precisely as a result of the abolition of property that this advantage, for one thing, would receive its greatest possible extension, and for another, only then be of social benefit. Excuse me. In the same way, they have attacked the huckstering spirit of small landed property, as if large landed property did not contain huckstering latent within it, even in its feudal form, not to speak of the modern English form, which combines the landlord's feudalism with the tenant farmer's huckstering and industry. Just as large landed property can return the reproach of monopoly leveled against it by partitioned land, since partitioned land is also based on the monopoly of private property, so can partitioned landed property likewise return to large landed property the reproach of partition, since partition also prevails there, although in a rigid and frozen form. Indeed, private property rests altogether on partitioning. Moreover, just as division of the land leads back to large landed property as a form of capital wealth, so must feudal landed property necessarily lead to partitioning, or at least fall into the hands of the capitalist, turn and twist as it may. For large landed property, as in England, drives the overwhelming majority of the population of the arms of industry and reduces its own workers to utter wretchedness. Thus it engenders and enlarges the power of its enemy, capital, industry, by throwing poor people in an entire activity of the country onto the other side. It makes the majority of the people of the country industrial and thus opponents of large landed property. Where industry has attained to great power, as in England at the present time, it progressively forces from large landed property its monopoly against foreign countries and throws it into competition with landed property abroad. For under the sway of industry, landed property could keep its feudal grandeur secure only by means of monopolies against foreign countries, thereby protecting itself against the general laws of trade, which are incompatible with its feudal character. So what he's suggesting is, can this be generalized in the context of colonialism in that particular instance? Once thrown into competition, landed property obeys the laws of competition like every other commodity subjected to competition. It begins thus to fluctuate, to decrease, and to increase, to fly from one hand to the other, and no law can keep it any longer in a few predestined hands. The immediate consequence is the splitting up of the land amongst many hands, and in any case, subjection to the power of industrial capitals. Finally, large landed property, which has been forcibly preserved in this way and has begotten by its side a tremendous industry, leads to crisis even more quickly than the partitioning of land, in comparison with which the power of industry remains constantly of second rank. Large landed property, as we see in England, has already cast off its feudal character and adopted an industrial character insofar as aiming to make as much money as possible. To the owner, it yields the utmost possible rent. To the tenant farmer, the utmost possible profit on his capital. The workers on the land, in consequence, have already been reduced to the minimum, and the class of tenant farmers already represents within landed property the power of industry and capital. As a result of foreign competition, rent in most cases can no longer form an independent income. A large number of landowners are forced to displace tenant farmers, some of whom, in this way, sink into the proletariat. On the other hand, many tenant farmers will take over landed property. For the big proprietors, who with their comfortable incomes have mostly given themselves over to extravagance, for the most part are not competent to conduct large-scale agriculture, often possess neither the capital nor the ability for the exploitation of the land. Hence, a section of this class, too, is completely ruined. Eventually, wages, which have already been reduced to minimum, must be reduced yet further to meet the new competition. This then necessarily leads to what? Revolution! Landed property had to develop in each of these two ways so as to experience in both its necessary downfall, just as industry, both in the form of monopoly and in that of competition, had to ruin itself so as to learn to believe in man. I know this moves all over the place, but he's telling a story here that the scale of this kind of enterprise is always going to get screwed up because of the need to, on the one hand, divide stuff. On the other hand, the responsibilities of those divisions are the capitalists and the landed large landed property owners really are clueless about, and you can see that if you've watched. Well, I always refer to Downton Abbey, but Downton Abbey does have a couple of examples of the Earl or whatever always not quite capable of trying to deal with the fact that he had to start dividing up his land, that he couldn't afford to manage a huge staff. So you see all those little smaller conflicts and antagonisms which make up the kind of soap opera of the story, but it is against this large problem of having a whole bunch of land, but they can't take care of it, and so the what's it that needs to go marry a rich American industrialist. So Downton Abbey has exactly that kind of thing, that you need Americans to come in and sort of subsume your the capital requirements of your landed property, and usually fail at doing it because there's all this other requirements rise as just simply the nature of primitive accumulation and then capitalist accumulation that force it into that position. Now, I included a section here on harvesting kelp. It's from a brief little article on Scottish kelp farming, but it's quite descriptive and is a good example of the kind of social history that's necessary that accompanies all of this kind of literature. It is, in fact, that social history literature that's really important in the 19th century for Marx, right? The working class, conditions of the working class, etc. Engels writing on that as well. A man and one or more of his children engaging from morning to night in cutting, drying, and otherwise preparing the seaweeds at a distance of many miles from his home, often for hours together, wet to his knees and elbows, living upon oatmeal and water with occasionally fish, limpets, and crabs, sleeping on the damp floor of a wretched hut, and with no other fuel than twigs or heath. So this is a kind of a primitive history on the one hand. On the other hand, you can see how it can kind of evolve because it's still a necessary component and has rent conditions built into it of various growing industries. So for a brief period from around 1750 to 1820, the West Coast and Islands of Scotland experienced a boom in demand for kelp, a seaweed-derived substance used in the soap and glass-making industries. Today, the word kelp is most commonly used to refer to several species of red, brown, and yellow seaweed, but in industrial context, it refers to a glassy, oily product created by burning dried seaweed. Kelp was and remains an important source of sodium, potassium, and iodine used in the processes of glass and soap manufacture, as well as in medicine, and as a thickening agent in foods and toothpaste. From the 16th century, the major source of these chemicals was barilla, imported from Spain, made by burning glasswort. Barilla was purer and chemically more consistent than rival products, such as the kelp ash produced in Ireland and the Scilly Isles. But war on the continent in the 18th century, remember all of that war on the continent in the 18th century, made supplies unreliable in a time of growing demand to the benefit of local producers of kelp. As the price of Scottish kelp rose from about £3 per ton in 1750 to a high of over £20 per ton in 1810, more and more communities turned to kelp production, and at its height, the industry employed about 10,000 families across Scotland. But in the decade following the Battle of Waterloo, with the lifting of punitive duties on continental imports, prices collapsed. Even with the highest grade of kelp had fallen back. And, you sort of ask, well, why weren't there kelp laws? Well, anyway, even the highest grade of kelp had fallen back to £3 a ton by 1827. The communities who had come to rely on kelp production for an income suffered great hardship, which contributed in turn to the subsequent history of emigration and clearance. So you have the whole, the migration history, the land clearance history, all of that is all part of this stuff. what's going on. It describes the specific road to this and more specific elements. But let me close with this. Kelping was far from being a free-for-all activity. Seaweed resources were very valuable, and the gathering of it was highly regulated. Estate owners prospered from the rental income and from buying and selling on the resulting kelp. Tenants employed subtenants and cotters to assist in the work. The turf hut at Alsary was probably the home of one such kelp worker, perhaps temporarily sited there during the spring and summer before returning to agricultural tasks in the west. So you can see here, a small island with a little lock, and you can see that along the shore here, you have all these little places where kelp can grow and which can be harvested, living in little huts and going down there for the season to, collect this stuff. Kelp harvesting and burning took place during the summer months, resulting kelp being transported for sale on the mainland by sloops whose tall masts filled the harbor during the kelping season. Anyway, so let me situate this within the context of Hudson. This is page 385, it's close to the end. But the fact is, and what I've been reading here at the front end of Marx in 1844, writing about this, is the idea of classical value and price theory. And you can see, hopefully, if you listen, that this is a problematic set of relations, not only for what Marx identifies as the sort of key villain, landed property owners, but also capitalists. I mean, he's only dealing with the landed property owners to sort of dispense with that, that's part of the history. We don't overfocus on it. And Marx, writing in 1844, is not on to the next step, which is to talk more about the industrial stuff. So do not overprivilege, this question of attacking a landed property so much as that it's simply a part of this entire, melange of pre-industrial and industrializing activity, the formation of a kelp commodity, for example. So this is Hudson writing towards the end, but he has one little section about, what should we do? Let's revive classical value and price theory with special emphasis on debt, as we were talking before. As chapter 3 is described, Francois Canet developed national income accounting to trace how much rent was taken and what landlords did with it. The subsequent value and price theory of Adam Smith and Ricardo served to isolate economic rent, enabling John Stuart Mill and other Ricardian socialists to demonstrate that taxing rent recaptures for society the natural resource, patrimony, and rising site value, like kelp. This rental valuation is created not by landlord efforts, but by society's overall prosperity and public investment in transportation systems, schools, and other infrastructure that define location, and location. The fight to recover land and natural resource rents for public use, along with making natural monopolies public, including banking, was waged in nearly every industrial nation in the decades leading up to World War I. Taxing rent aimed to lower taxes on consumers and industry, while public infrastructure lowered the prices of key economic needs. The past century has reversed matters by privatizing the land's site value, mineral rents, and basic infrastructure rents to be paid mainly to banks as interest. And we saw that in the prior chapter about the question of, what's the bank's role in all of these things. Seeking to erase memory of classical rent theory. Remember, I've been talking about this idea of, memories. Today's financial power grab pretends that Adam Smith and his followers sought to free such rent seeking from taxation and regulation, not free economies from rentier elites. So, in other words, you can attack the rents, but, there's other classes you might care more about. Failure to create a more progressive tax system reflects the inability of 19th century free market doctrine to achieve the political and lawmaking power needed to liberate economies from the vestiges of feudalism. So, this is why we're back to techno-feudalism. Landlordism, stemming from the military conquest of Europe and the regions it's colonized, still doing that. Banking in private hands with the creditor-oriented laws. And 3, monopolies created by public fiat and sold to pay royal war debts, or more recently, deficits from cutting taxes on rentiers and the rest of the 1%. So essentially, we still have the same damn problems. What Marx is talking about in terms of monopolies in the mid 19th century are still kind of the same screwy crap that we have to put up with now. And I included, this is from Dilip Basu's book, which I've read a little bit from before, but nobody will remember. It's an article on Marx's theory of rent, which is sort of integrated into his, big deal tenure book. The problem, of course, in this little article and in his book is that he sort of tries to set absolute rent as zero. And I'm not going to argue with it. I just think that he's just making his job easier and not really sort of tackling the real problem of what counts as the concept of absolute rent relative to capital formation. But anyway, I won't read this. You can read it yourself, but it is the beginning of the chapter of the article's chapter to distinguish, which we have already done, as I think that in this little reading here, the difference between fundamentalists and neo-Ricardians, because it is the argument that Marx begat in the mid-19th century is between this somewhat fundamental issue kind of built on rent, but rent is a symptom of that set of divisions. And so that's why Ricardians continued on doing what they're doing, partially because they wanted to be able to pursue a kind of materialist agenda without constantly being called commies, with all due respect. I mean, it is unfortunate, but from an academic point of view, you can see how difficult that was for example, Kamala Harris's father, Donald. I mean, he's just a neo-Ricardian after all. But when you go down and read it actually in detail, all right, yeah, it's a Marxian problem, but you're not going to get anywhere, by constantly talking about Marx, because people will screw with you for all the wrong reasons. And so that's kind of what happened. For example, you could say a couple of people in this little realm here had issues about being called Marxists, which they all managed to get tenure and do whatever they were going to do. Doreen Massey, Anne Marcuson, etc. And in the neo-Ricardian side, you have Alan Scott, who did some of the earliest neo-Ricardian work. And then Kurtz, Bose, Gibson, etc. So anyway, you can read that at your leisure. I've reached the end of my little yakathon here. Let me ask if you have questions that I can answer before we go back to our regularly scheduled program. No.
Are you sure you're not a Georgist?
No, I don't. I believe that it's important to reduce to propose single tax theories, but ultimately, as we've seen with the sort of so-called neo-physiocrats, that ultimately you can't get down to a single tax. It just gets it starts getting bureaucratized again.
Well said.
But yes, at a certain moment, we're all Georgists. Let's put it that way. But then we have to sort of, move to the next thing. I think Georgism at the front end is really important, but you need to get to the next step. It's just like being a modern monetary theorist. It's all fine, but then you got to start talking about other stuff, and then that makes you more radical or whatever. You have to start accounting for other things.
Mostly agree. Very much agreed.
Ideological matters intervene, let's put it that way, to be kind about it.
So every day I've been talking about Georgists. Georgists. A cold day through.
Georgists on my mind.
Well done, Lane.
All right, so let me put in the link to try to convince you that it's worth reading a little bit about this anyway. And I will stop the live stream because I sort of rambled on and such cute hedgehogs. We'll note the huge